Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. Thank you all for being here at this uncertain times and gathering here together. We're very happy that today we get to welcome our speaker today, Nina Pavcnik from Dartmouth University. My name is Howard Inklaar from the Groningen Growth and Development Center, and as your chair for this session. So mostly housekeeping. I'll stop in a minute and pass the mic to Gijssen de Vries, who will introduce Nina. Afterwards, we'll hear her lecture for approximately an hour. Afterwards, there's ample room for Q&A with all of you. And then at around 4:30, we adjourn this session and continue in the plaza with drinks, and everyone is invited to join us there. So, Gijssen.
Great. Good afternoon. Welcome to the 2020 Maddison Lecture that is organized by the Groningen Growth and Development Center. The Groningen Growth and Development Center is a platform for research on economic growth and development, and this research is largely based on a range of comprehensive databases on indicators of growth and development that the center compiles and maintains on a regular basis. Now, one of the GGDC's continued lines of research is measuring and analyzing productivity growth, as well as the factor income distribution. And Professor Nina Pavcnik is one of the world's most influential scholars of international development economics, and she has made rather seminal contributions both on productivity growth and on changes in income inequality. And on a personal note, when I started as a PhD student, I studied productivity growth in Latin America. And Nina's 2002 paper in the Review of Economic Studies on firm productivity in Chile, for me that provided an anchor and a benchmark of quality for my own research. And now we're almost 20 years on, and as it happens, I continue to carefully read Nina's work, particular recent work with her, with Brian McGeck, that examines how new export opportunities affected structural transformation in Vietnam. That's a landmark contribution. And Nina's talk today, Nina's talk today will aim to deepen our understanding of the implications of trade for job outcomes and the factor income distribution in developing countries. So among others, it's going to challenge the conviction among many international economists that worker adjustment costs to trade liberalization are short run. Often they are found to have long-run impacts on wages and employment opportunities, as well as carry implications for income mobility, education and health outcomes due to frictions in the labor market. Now, these topics are enormously important to discuss and to contemplate. So therefore, it's with special excitement that I'm very pleased to welcome Nina to give the 2020 Maddison Lecture. Now, we're not allowed to shake hands anymore, but we are allowed to use our hands to give a very warm welcome to Professor Pavcnik. So please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you. Oops. Can you hear me, or is it? Yeah. Thank you very much for. Can you hear still? Yeah. Thank you very much for such a lovely introduction. I'm honored to be here. And I was actually looking at, this is like, I guess, the 10th Maddison Lecture. So I was looking at what people have lectured on before. And it's interesting that it started off as a lecture on growth. But the past few lectures have been much focused on the inequality. And I think that very much shows what we are concerned about these days as economists and as society at large. It also provides a good introduction into like what I've been interested in my research. So as it was mentioned in the introduction, I started off focusing a lot on how does international trade affect productivity of companies. But as I was researching that, I always wondered, well, how do these trade policy changes not just affect companies, but also workers that work in these companies and families that these workers support. So my research has very much kind of switched back and forth between looking at questions of how trade affects growth and inequality back and forth, because ultimately they are very much interlinked. Today I'm going to focus on the inequality bit, and in part because, as we all know, in the past few years we have had renowned rises in protectionism, especially in high-income countries such as UK and United States. Whenever economists are asked whether or not we should go back to protectionism or strive to have liberalized trade policy, we often say that we always support freer trade, in part because we believe that if countries engage in freer trade, that raises nations' aggregate welfare and income. Okay, and that's our knee-jerk reaction to the question whether or not trade should be free. However, what's interesting is that the roots of current protectionisms do not actually lie in public's misconceptions whether or not trade is good for economy as a whole. So when the current backlash for protectionism started, I was curious about, what do people think about aggregate benefits of international trade? So I what this graph shows is basically it ranks countries by GDP per capita. So you go from kind of the poorest countries to the richer countries. And then on the y-axis, it records the answer of of representative sample within each of the countries to the question of whether or not trade and business ties of this particular country are good for the country as a whole. And one thing that you can notice is that, in virtually every country that was surveyed, and there were over 40 countries surveyed, most people in these countries actually agree with economists. They believe that, in aggregate, trade is good for their country as a whole. Even in the United States, almost 7 out of 10 people will answer the question that trade benefits their country. But in all the other countries, these questions are even, the answer to this question is even more pronouncedly positive. So this is actually one question where economists and general public agree. So, however, if we go on and look at other questions that this survey asks, there's more disagreement. And what, in particular, there's actually less agreement in the public at large on how trade impacts livelihood of workers. So in this particular graph, I again ranked countries by GDP per capita, and then I basically denoted responses of public in all these countries on whether or not trade lowers wages, if they believe that trade destroys jobs, and then also checking whether or not trade raises wages and creates jobs. And what you see here is there's much less agreement between developed and developing countries on how they perceive trade affects the livelihood of workers. And what you can see is that, in in richer countries like United States, almost half of people believe that trade lowers wages and destroys jobs. And very few believe that it raises wages and creates jobs. Whereas, the majority of people in lower income countries such as Vietnam and China actually believe that very few say that trade lowers wages and destroy jobs, and many more say associate trade with higher wages and job creation. So, but here you very much see that there is disagreement between what people in richer countries believe versus people in the poorer countries believe. And what does this show us? Well, what this shows us, this graph actually kind of shows us perhaps that, what, for example, Branko Milanovic, who gave the keynote last year, believes, has claimed is that, well, perhaps the rising living standards of poorer workers in less developed countries such as China and Vietnam, those have come at the cost of welfare of workers in richer countries. Okay, that's one thing that, like, this graph might suggest. The other thing that it might suggest that motivates my lecture is that, public is very much concerned about how international trade affects the livelihood of workers and more broadly income inequality. Okay, and what I'm going to focus on in today's lecture is going to try to give you some key facts on what we have learned from this research. If some of you in the audience are maybe not that interested in equality, let me give you a few reasons, why we should care about it. For once, is we know that currently in a lot of countries there is this backlash against globalization. So to the extent that we want to, even if you don't care necessarily about inequality and you just care about increasing aggregate efficiencies of how economy operates, well, to the extent that trade is actually beneficial for aggregate efficiency, we probably as a society want to implement policies that help people who get hurt by trade, because then they are less likely to oppose international trade. So, to do that, we first need to know, well, who benefits and who loses, okay? The second thing we need to know is that, what are the channels through which international trade affects companies and individuals that work in them as well as their families, because through that, again, we can have better targeting of policies that can assist individuals that are harmed by international trade. And the third reason is maybe the moral reason, because we want to help people who are disadvantaged by international trade or technology or other economic factors. Okay, the good news is that because we have much more detailed data on companies, firms, and workers over the past 40 years. We actually have made quite a bit of progress on our understanding about who benefits and who loses from trade and how trade ultimately shapes inequality. Okay, and some of these consequences of international trade on individuals and families would actually not be observed if we just focus more on more aggregate outcomes or just how companies in kind of registered sectors do. Okay. Before I move on, I just want to mention that there's actually a pretty large tradition that started in the 1980s of international economists working with development economists on issues of trade and inequality. And actually, this is a research where women in economics actually were highly represented. It started off with Ann Kruger in her basically classic collection of studies from early 1980s. It continued with Ann Harrison in the 90s and early 2000s. These are all people that have inspired me to pursue these topics as well. Okay, so what I want to do first, when we move, as I move my talk to on trade and inequality, is I first want to mention that I'm going to be mostly focusing on this topic from the perspective of labor markets. I'm going to be ignoring consumption at this point in time. What have we as economists known about how trade affects inequality by affecting wages and employment of workers? Oftentimes these days, if one reads media, one would think that economists have not thought much about inequality. But that's not true. Economists have thought about how trade affects inequality for many, many years. And we have long predicted that international trade will generate both winners and losers. And it will generate winners and losers both in developed countries as well as in developing countries. So, why does that happen? Well, there are many possible explanations, but virtually every model of international trade, even the ones that basically assume that it's very easy for workers to switch jobs across companies or move to one location or another, so there are like no labor market frictions, or like models that don't assume away any frictions on the credit market. So again, assuming that it's very easy to borrow money, even in this frictionless world, models predict that when trade changes prices of goods, that will change distribution of income within a country. And just to take a very simple Hepshire-Lean model that has two factors of production, and let's say educated and less educated labor, and two goods, trade was actually in that model predicted to benefit the less educated individuals within developing countries and hurt the more educated individuals in developing countries. Why? Well, because in that model, trade is based on comparative advantage, and when lower income countries that are relatively abundant in less educated labor integrate with the rest of the economy, the demand for services of less educated workers was supposed to go up. That was supposed to increase their real wages and actually lower the real wages of the scarce factor of production, which was less educated labor. So, 40 years ago, before we had much information about how labor markets actually adjusted, this gave development and trade economists at institutions such as the World Bank and IMF a lot of hope about the benefits of international trade, particularly for developing countries. Why? Well, this model predicts that trade should generate aggregate gains and simultaneously reduce poverty, because less educated workers are more likely to be poor, and also by reducing the wages of more educated and increasing the real wages of less educated, also reduce inequality. Okay? However, what we have learned by with the cumulative evidence based on 25 years of research on the effects of trade on labor markets is that how trade affects labor markets is much, much more nuanced than this simple model would suggest. Okay? So, how have we learned that? Well, the way we have learned that is that we have taken advantage of the fact that after 1980s, many developing countries have actually integrated into the global economy. So what this graph here shows, it basically shows from 1870 to a little bit over 2010. It gives us expansion of global trade as measured by export as a percent of global GDP. And what you see here is that we have had periods of globalization in the past. But one thing that's really striking is that, basically since the 1990s, we have entered this era of what people have titled as hyper-globalization, where you see that, regardless of how we measure trade, be it in services or with in value-added terms or in gross terms, which is, kind of the most common, you see that kind of exports as a share of GDP have really grown substantially during this period. And part of why this happened is that we have integration of lots of developing countries through their trade liberalizations during this time period. To give you a better sense how important integration of developing countries is during this time period, and here it's not just China, it's more broadly. What this graph shows you is from 1980s onwards. It gives you percentage of world exports by income groups as categorized by the World Bank in 1987. So what this graph does, it basically puts a country into 4 different bins: high income, upper middle income, lower middle income, and low income, based on where the country was in 1987 income. So, for example, China it was a low income country at that time, so it continues to be in the low income category throughout the graph. And then basically what the graph checks is what share of world exports, and we saw that those have been rising, is accounted for by each of these 4 groups. And again, here you see that lower middle income and upper middle income countries are accounting for increasing share of world exports, which are growing at the same time. Okay. What we as researchers have done is we have basically studied many large-scale trade policy changes that countries have implemented, either by themselves through unilateral trade liberalization episodes, such as, for example, India, or by joining World Trade Organization, such as China, or by studying what happens when developing countries gain access due to trade policy changes to developed countries' markets. Okay, so that's the first component, like how we have gained more evidence over the 25 past year on the consequences of trade integration. The other thing that's very important is that, unlike in developed countries where most of the policy changes were increased import competition and lowering import barriers, in developing countries, because we have so many countries and so many policy changes, some took some took the form of import market liberalizations, and others actually took the form of increased access to exports, okay? And that, again, enabled us as researchers to better examine how increased trade, either through increased import competition or increased access to exports, shaped earnings and employment opportunities of individuals in developing countries. So just keep that in mind, because most of the studies that we actually have for developed countries mostly focused on increased import competition. And maybe some of you have already come across the very influential recent studies by David Otter, Gordon Hanson, David Dorn, and co-authors. From developing countries, we have those sort of studies, as well as studies that focus on export opportunities. Okay. And then the third thing that really has benefited this research is that we, since 1980s, many countries, including many countries in developing countries, have started systematically collecting representative surveys of companies, workers, and households, so that, as researchers, we're actually able to observe these economic agents before, during, and after trade policy change to better understand how they are affected. And, and based on all these three components, we have learned quite a bit about how trade integration has been affected labor markets, and through that inequality. Okay. So what is the evidence? And basically the new, even though this topic that trade is going to increase inequality or affect inequality within countries is old, all this new evidence actually has generated a lot of new findings. And to kind of summarize very broadly what those are, is the first one is that increased international trade is not the main reason why wage inequality has increased in many developing countries. Okay, and that's due based, conclusion is based on kind of empirical studies that are surveyed in my survey with Penny Goldberg and my own surveys, as well as by conclusions of more quantitative findings that rely more on theory and quantitative methods that are surveyed by Elkanah Helpman in his recent book. Okay. Nonetheless, even though trade is not the main reason for growing wage inequality, trade policy and trade still matter in how they affect worker earnings and employment opportunities, and through that poverty and inequality. So the one thing that we need to be very careful about is what sort of answers we provide to questions that as economists we are often asked. Things like, is trade good for the poor? Does trade increase inequality? We don't have any easy answers to that. The answers to that depend very much on what sort of trade policy change or trade patterns persist in a particular country that we are discussing, and what are the underlying economic mechanisms through which trade effects can affect inequality. It depends a lot on how easy it's for workers and also capital or investment to move across companies, across regions, across industries. And finally, it also depends a lot on where in the income distributions individuals are within a country. Okay. What I'm gonna do for the remainder of the lecture is kind of illustrate this by focusing on 4 facts that we have learned from this literature on how trade affects earnings and employment opportunities from this very, very broad area of study. Okay, so basically what I'm going to do from now on is kind of illustrate this with 4 key facts. Okay. So the first thing that I want to mention is that one thing that we have learned over the past 20 years is that how workers' employment opportunities and wages will be affected depends a lot on what type of firm a worker works for. And this kind of goes back to this literature on productivity that has shown that even when we focus on very narrow industries, companies within that industry differ a lot in terms of their underlying productivity. Some are more productive than others. We also have learned that companies that perform better, including in terms of their productivity, tend to pay more because they either, they believe in fair wages, they believe in efficiency wages, or they profit share. Okay. And also, the third thing that we have learned is that if you are a better performing company, you are in much better position to withstand the challenges of import competition, but also you also are in better position to take advantage of new exporting opportunities. Okay, and what that means is that given that we already, that we start off with workers in better performing firms, getting paid more, even if they have the same, education or experience and gender than workers in worse performing firms. International trade, by influencing better performing firms differently than less performing firms, actually exacerbates this this inequalities across workers that work in different companies. And let me give you a couple examples. Let's consider import competition. So when an industry observes basically an increase in import competition, that's going to lower the demand for products that this industry produces. However, different companies within this industry will be affected differently, and it's usually kind of the less productive companies in the literature in the industry that are most likely to contract and potentially even go bankrupt. And what that means is that if you're a worker working in one of these worst performing companies, you are much more likely to lose a job. And we have evidence on that. Okay? The other channel through which trade is going to exacerbate differences in earnings among workers, depending on what type of firms they work, is through exporting. So in particular, when firms are going to start exporting, that's going to increase wage inequality between firms in the industry. Why? Because we know that better performing firms already pay better, but then better performing firms are much more likely to take advantage of these exporting opportunities, and they're going to be, as a result of that, basically expanding their revenue and sharing some of this revenue through higher wages with workers that work for them. So here there's another channel through which trade will be affecting inequality of workers depending on which company they work in. The other thing that we have learned, and this is why I have that worker education also matters, is that we have learned that if you're an exporting company, you actually tend to focus on the type of tasks that demand a lot of that have high demand for education and skill, and in particular. This is particularly the case in developing countries because oftentimes these companies in these companies might be exporting to high-income country markets, and those consumers in high-income country markets demand probably higher quality products than their local consumers, and production of quality requires education and skill. Or also kind of production and also marketing of kind of high quality products also requires skill and education. And for that reason, we will also observe increases in inequality between more and less educated workers that work in the same company. Okay, so those are kind of conclusions from a large body of studies that have focused on examining how have workers in kind of formal companies in developing countries fared as a result of trade. But I want to point out is that like most of those studies mostly focus on companies that are kind of registered or formal in developing countries. Okay, and the good things about those studies is that you can examine what's happening to workers in response to trade policy change as well as to the company at the same time because you have data on both, particularly if you have kind of matched employee-employee data, okay? The disadvantages of these studies are, however, also exist. And for example, if a worker loses a job in one of these companies, you don't observe them, and those are potentially the workers who are going to be suffering the most from trade policy liberalizations. Okay, and the other thing that they want to emphasize is if you're focusing on developing countries, in those countries, registered formal firms account for a very, very small share of manufacturing employment. And so basically, you're missing a lot of workers if you're just focusing on these firms. So, for example, like in Brazil, 70% of manufacturing workers are in formal registered firms. So you're missing 30% of manufacturing workers. In a country like India, you're missing 80% of manufacturing workers if you're just focused on registered firms. And in a country like Vietnam, you are missing about 60% of workers if you're just focusing on registered firms. So, because of that, we would like to know more, like, well, how are the workers in the non-registered sector affected? And the other thing that is important is the type of workers that select to work in registered manufacturing tend to be more educated. And so, again, we have maybe missing the more vulnerable workers if we are just focusing on this sort of studies, okay? The final reason why we might want to be looking at, kind of beyond kind of how workers in formal manufacturing are affected is because if we look at lower income countries, vast majority of these workers are going to be basically self-employed, either in their own micro enterprise or in their own family farm. So in particular, what this graph shows, again, here we have GDP per capita at PPP levels, so the richer countries are here. And here we give a percent of labor force that is self-employed, so that's like a good proxy for kind of informality, not perfect proxy, but not a bad one. And what you see that the poorer the country is, the higher share of its labor force is going to be in self-employment or informality. Okay? However, and again, if we are thinking about how would international trade potentially, what are the channels through which we think that international trade is most likely to potentially reduce poverty and improve kind of employment opportunities of workers? Well, it might be by contributing to economic development and growth and pulling people out of agriculture either into services or manufacturing, or from working in informal micro enterprises toward formal firms. And again, all the studies that I've just summarized are not well equipped to look at these mechanisms. Okay? The good news is that we recently have had quite a bit of work that actually has tried to use data that has both formal and informal firms, or at least the labor markets, and kind of look at does international trade actually help workers move out of agriculture to other services, to services and manufacturing, or from informal to formal markets? Okay, and let me highlight a couple of those studies. So the first study is actually by two economists, Jessica Leicht and Bilge Erten. And what they have examined, they were interested in how international trade through improved exporting opportunities affects labor markets in China. And basically they focus on Chinese WTO accession in 2001. And you see that during this time period, in this graph, we basically, over time, we show employment in millions of people in, basically in agriculture, manufacturing, and mining, and then services. And you see that during this, and this is the time of WTO accession, and you see that number of workers in agriculture has been declining, whereas employment in services and also manufacturing has been on the rise. And what they try to do is they basically try to examine, well, how much did China's accession to WTO contribute to this process? And what they do is they basically take advantage of the fact, and we'll see this is going to be a repeated theme in my talk, that different areas, different countries within China were differentially exposed to WTO accession because of the kind of pre-existing industry composition in those counties. In particular, there were some counties within China that had a larger share in their local employment of industries that benefited from basically reductions in uncertainty about tariffs that China faced in the United States as a result of its WTO accession. And basically what this study does is basically examines, well, how did these counties fare relative to counties that were less exposed to Chinese accession to WTO. And what do they find? Okay, what they found is that these counties that were, more exposed to the export of opportunities through WTO accession, they increased exports and FDI. Okay, so we see that trade has increased out of these counties. They also observed that employment in agriculture decreases, where employment in manufacturing and mining increases, as well as employment in services. And then they actually find that with that, investments in agriculture decrease, an increase in manufacturing and services. And that corresponds to increasing total and per capita GDP, as well as declines in poverty. Okay, so here is an example of a study that, when it focuses on not just on manufacturing, but a broader set of activities within counties, paints like a broader picture of how trade can affect poverty and inequality. In this particular case, workers in these provinces are actually becoming less poor. Okay. Let me give you an example of a study that focuses on how trade affects transition from informal micro-enterprises to formal firms by focusing on Vietnam and how Vietnam was affected by expanding exporting opportunities. And this is a work by myself and Brian McKegg. What we've examined is how did workers in Vietnam fare as a result of the 2001 bilateral trade agreement that Vietnam signed with the United States. I should mention that kind of the key policy change during this trade agreement was opening of export markets of United States for Vietnamese companies, because the main policy change that happened was that United States lowered import tariffs on Vietnamese goods. The reason why Vietnam didn't really lower their tariffs on U.S. goods is because they have already done that earlier by basically putting, by giving United States kind of most favored nation tariffs. Okay, you see that this agreement happened in 2001. You see that it had pretty large impact on Vietnam's exports to the United States, which were virtually non-existent prior to 2001 because of the trade embargo from U.S.-Vietnam war. And you see that after that, the overall exports expand very drastically, and this is particularly driven by manufacturing exports and less so in primary goods exports. So over the span of 4 years, U.S. became the largest Vietnam's partner, and it accounted actually for 25% of Vietnamese exports by 2004. Okay. If you think about kind of the economic theory and what this theory predicts and how Vietnamese companies and workers should be affected, this theory predicts that prior to the agreement, these high import tariffs on Vietnamese exports were particularly binding for well-performing companies. If you recall, kind of what we just discussed before, and how trade affects different firms. So once these tariffs are reduced, that enables more productive firms to expand and take advantage of new exporting opportunities, because they are the ones who are profitable enough to to kind of pay the fixed cost of entering the export markets. However, this would kind of bid up, the theory predicts that this would bid up wages in the Vietnamese economy and make it more difficult for smaller kind of micro enterprises to compete with these larger firms because they have to pay higher wages. Or it's going to be harder for them to keep workers because workers now have better opportunities in the formal sector. So those companies would be contracting. So so what we would expect to see based on economic theory is that the share of informal employment within industry should be decreasing, and that's exactly kind of what we observe. So in particular, this particular graph shows us here change in U.S. tariffs. So the industries with the largest tariff cuts are here. And on the y-axis, I have the share of change in the informal employment within an industry between 2000 and 2004. And here are the negative numbers. And you basically see from here to here, and you basically see that in most industries, informal employment decreased. And it decreased more so in industries that were subject to higher U.S. tariff cuts during this period. So again, here we have a study that shows how expanding export opportunities do actually lead to reduction in informality within countries. And again, if we just focused on formal manufacturing firms, we would miss this important channel that kind of shows how workers from the informal sector get integrated into the formal sector with employment opportunities. Okay. So that kind of concludes my first fact, that like firms matter, but like in developing countries, we have to pay attention to basically farms and informal micro enterprises to kind of get a better version of how, a better or a broader understanding of how trade affects labor market opportunities. Okay. What's the, and actually the thing that I want to mention there is that, when you move from the informal to formal sector, not only do you get higher wages, but you actually also get a much more stable work job. You will be working longer hours, but those are going to be more regular and more stable. And you're going to be less likely to hold multiple jobs. Okay? And the other, and that's actually pretty important because especially in the developing countries, a lot of people hold multiple jobs on the labor market when those are not developed, and that's actually very difficult to do. Okay. And the other thing that Banerjee and Duflo have shown is that like when they actually look at like what's so different between people who are middle class versus poor across many countries, they actually have noted that it's not that like entrepreneurial activities, it's actually access to a stable job. And and both what the examples from China and Vietnam illustrate is that like basically trade enabled people to get access to this stable job as opposed to kind of trying to make ends meet by holding multiple jobs, okay, with much more irregular work patterns. Okay. So the second fact that I want to give you. The second fact that I want to give you is kind of goes back to this question that this point that I made before, that if we look at the economy overall, trade actually is not the main culprit for why wage inequality has increased in developed and developing countries. Okay, but what we should be very careful that we don't then conclude that trade doesn't matter for inequality, because what we have learned through many studies recently is that trade's kind of negative impacts or harms are very, very geographically concentrated, as are its benefits. Okay, and this geographic concentration I'll show you later, is not just affected it does not just affect the labor market, but it has a lot of important spillovers for communities and for education of next generation. And in particular, what we have learned is that kind of the effects of trade on earnings and employment opportunities within a country depend on, again, kind of regions' exposure to import and export shocks. And in particular, if you're an individual that lives in a region where a lot of the industry can benefit from export opportunities, then you're going to fare better off relative to workers living in other regions. And likewise, if you're an individual in a region that has high concentration of industries that are facing increased import competition, you will be faring worse than workers in less exposed regions to import competition. Okay, so some of you, especially a lot of you are very young. You're like, well, if I don't get a job in this region, why should I can just move to a region where there are more employment opportunities. And that's actually exactly the sort of thinking that trade economists have had about responses of individuals to trade shocks. We thought, well, maybe trade is going to have negative consequences for individuals in the short run, but over time, workers that lose jobs in one region can maybe just move to another region where there are more employment opportunities for workers of the same type of education. And here I'm ignoring the fact that some of the models in trade actually predict that like how you're going to fare just really depends on your education. So you might not be better off. But what we have found, study after study, is that it's actually very difficult for workers to move across regions. Especially, it's really difficult for workers or individuals to move out of regions that were adversely affected by increased import competition. And this immobility is actually even happens, 5, 9, and even up to in some studies up to 20 years following a large stabilization shock. And there are a lot of studies that I list there. This is supported by evidence not just from United States, that is more recent from Otterdorn and Hansen, but also earlier evidence from India, Brazil, Mexico, Vietnam, China, and South America. So this again going back to the points that I made previously, some believe that basically kind of the drop in the standard of living of middle class in rich countries has happened because of increased living standard of individuals in the poor countries. What this point illustrates that basically we're going to have regions within both poor and rich countries that are going to be negatively affected by import competition. Okay. So let me give you two stories again here based on two studies. One that shows concentrated benefits, and this one focuses again on Vietnam, and the other one that shows concentrated losses. In reality, like the reason, so let me give you first the concentrated benefit story. This is again going back to Vietnam and Vietnam's export liberalization as a result of this trade agreement with the United States that I just mentioned. During this time period, aggregate poverty in Vietnam was dropping, okay? And it was happening because Vietnam was growing quite a bit. However, what Brian McKagan in his earlier work and then jointly with me has done is he has examined, like the study for China, whether or not some areas of Vietnam who had higher concentration of industries that could benefit from exporting, did they fare better or worse than other regions? And what all these studies have found is that if you lived in a province with high concentration of exporting industries, you observed relatively larger increase in wages, and especially if you were less educated workers. You also were much more likely to move from these informal micro enterprises to formal sector. You observe declines in household poverty, and what we actually observe is that people are actually immigrating into these provinces. So again, this is a story where people are responding to the benefits of international trade, and as a result of that, becoming better off. And you might be wondering, well, what's unique about Vietnam that makes this process easier? Well, for once, it's a very narrow country, so kind of just transportation costs are not that large to move from inland toward the more coastal areas where most of these exporting opportunities were located. But on top of that, it was actually at the time of these trade policy changes, it had relatively younger population, and it also had population that was relatively well educated because of the communist past of this country that invested a lot into education relative to countries of elsewhere with similar economic development. And we know from other work that if you're younger and more educated individuals are much more likely to have lower adjustment costs. Okay, so that's the positive story. Let me focus on the less positive story, which focuses on India's 91 import liberalization that Petya Topalova has examined. So India implemented a very large-scale import liberalization, where import tariffs were reduced from like 80 on average from 80% to like 30%. So large drop in import taxes. Okay. What happened during this time, and again, during this time period, aggregate poverty in India was actually declining, again, mainly because of kind of underlying economic growth. But what Topalova did, and this was actually really kind of the first study that relied on these regional differences in exposure to trade within countries, what she actually did is she actually checked whether regions within India that had higher concentration of industries that faced import competition fared better or worse than other regions. And what she finds is that if you were a family that lived in a kind of harder hit district, you experienced declines in industry wages, declines in agricultural wages, and as a result, increases in poverty relative to people in other regions. And so here we have the opposite, but similar mechanisms as in Vietnam. Here, import competition is making individuals worse off. And why is this happening? Well, because you have very low mobility across districts in India, even up to 9 years after trade reform. And again, why is that happening? Is that people, a lot of these people are in rural areas, and less than 1% of rural individuals move within 10 years. Even in urban areas, less than 5% people move within 10 years. And this mobility is particularly low for the poor, and because of that, they can't actually kind of face the regular mobility cost, pay regular mobility costs. But there are a couple other things that also matter. So Topalova, for example, shows that how rigid the labor markets are in a particular state influences how people move across district lines. And in particular, if you're a state in which labor laws are very rigid, it's actually very hard for companies, even that can benefit from export opportunities, to expand their product lines and capacity, and that kind of drags down overall development. Okay. The other thing that actually plays a really important role is that in a society like India, where there is not much formal social insurance, people rely on informal social networks for when they face health shocks or for retirement or on childcare. And in particular, kind of the caste system in India generates disincentive for people to move away into places with additional opportunities. So that's very different from kind of the situation that I just described in Vietnam. Okay, so and in reality, what happens is that both, we have import competing regions and export oriented regions within countries. And, you can see how individuals, depending on where they live, experience very different reality when trade policy changes happen. Okay? So that's the second point I want to make. The third point that I want to make is that trade actually has very long-lasting intergenerational consequences. Okay, so all the way up to now, I mainly kind of focused on what are the effects of trade on earnings and employment opportunities, either of workers or regions in which these workers live. Okay. However, trade can actually by affecting labor markets and incomes of families, it can actually also affect the incentives that families have, or ability that the families have to invest into education of their children. Okay, and through that, it's going to be having not just effects on labor force today, but also on the labor force participation and economic opportunities of individuals, of today's young individual. There's actually a large literature that looks at how trade affects schooling and child labor. And what that literature finds, the most important channel through which trade affects schooling and child labor is how it affects family income. So in particular, if your family is benefiting from international trade because your parents get a higher paying job, or they have or they actually gain access to a job, those parents will then invest into children's education, and children are going to be more likely to go to school and less likely to go to work. However, if your family's income is negatively affected as a result of tribalization, okay, those families are going to have to make some very, very difficult choices. And in particular, we have evidence from same Indian families that I just discussed in a couple slides by Petya Topalova, where we basically have found that Indian families that lived in regions that were hard hit by increased import competition as a result of India's trade reform experienced a negative income shock, and as a result of that, also that had negative consequences for the schooling of their children. Again, during this time period, because of just economic growth, education in India and school attendance was improving. However, school-age children, and especially the girls, that lived in these hard-hit districts observed declines in school attendance, declines in school completion, and declines in literacy relative to kind of school-day children in districts that were less affected. And that actually comes at the cost of lower lifelong income, because we know from other studies that if you are less educated, you will have many fewer opportunities, especially for kind of well-paying jobs. Okay. The interesting thing about this Indian case is that when families, the reason why families were pulling children out of school is because these were families that were affected, were basically living at the threshold of poverty. So they really did not have much resources to spare when they were subject to this decline in income. And because of that, they basically one way through which they were able to save, make ends meet is they basically were trying to save on schooling costs. And that's why children were pulled out of school. So what we actually found is that not that like children that were pulled out of school then went to work in the informal or formal labor market. They were either idle at home or they were helping with kind of family chores or on with a family micro enterprise or farm. Okay, so here's an example where perhaps government by not paying actually that much money, but subsidizing schooling costs could help with kind of spillovers of negative consequences of immigration of trade for next generation. And this is why it's kind of important to kind of have these kind of detailed studies that kind of examine not just what happens to schooling, but also like why is schooling reduced. Okay. The final thing that I actually want to mention, and then I'm going to stop, is that these adverse effects of import competition are very persistent over time and can actually amplify with time. They can actually get worse with time. And we only have like 2 countries in which this sort of study that follows workers over like up to 20 years after trade policy change happened. One of them is for United States, and the other one is from Brazil. And I'm going to focus on the one for Brazil because I'm focusing on developing countries, but the findings are actually very similar for United States. So this is work by Rafael Dix Carneiro and Brian Kovac that basically have examined long-term consequences of Brazil's import liberalization in early 90s. So again, like the main policy change was reduction in import barriers on different parts of Brazil. And again, there are some parts, the lighter ones that were more affected by increased import competition and some parts that were less affected. Okay? And what they do is they use matched employee and employer data as well as census data to basically track workers over time based on how exposed they were to trade policy change. Okay, and what they find is that these negative effects on earnings and employment actually get bigger over time. So let me show you those effects. So here on the x-axis I have years. Okay, so here's the trade liberalization starts in 91, concludes by 95. This is pre-period, this is post-period. And on the y-axis, I basically I plot the effect that lower trade barriers had on earnings and on employment. And this just focuses on the formal sector. So what you see here is that during trade liberalization, earnings get reduced a little bit, but not so much. Earnings in the formal sector actually get substantially more reduced over time. And that's the same with formal employment. So you might be wondering, well, how can that happen? And part of it is that people are not moving out of the regions that were hard hit by trade policy change. Part of it is that they're actually negative agglomeration economies. When the formal sector is negatively impacted by trade, that has spillovers for other non-tradables in the economy. But the third thing that's actually really interesting is that the slow adjustment of labor is actually also affected by slow adjustment of capital. So what happens? What seems to be happening is that companies, they're trying to make ends meet despite this increased import competition. So they try to hold on as long as they can. And because capital appreciates only slowly over time, the companies contract and ultimately go bankrupt kind of slowly over time, and that leads to this delayed response in the labor market as well. So what this graph here shows, it follows the same format as the graphs that I've shown you before. Here we kind of look at how did this import liberalization affect establishment size and number of formal firms, and you see that it led to a drop on the establishment size. But you see the other thing that's happening is that number of formal establishment is also decreasing with time in response to import competition. But this happens kind of just slowly over time. Why does it happen slowly over time? Well, this graph here separately looks at cumulative establishment entry, so like how firms are entering into the regions more negatively affected by import competition, and cumulative establishment exit. And you see that immediately, during trade reform, establishment exit decreases, and then it kind of stays, decreases, and it stays negative. Whereas exit increases initially, but then really increases over time. Because as companies kind of slowly depreciate capital just over time exit, and that leads to negative job creation rate in these regions and positive job destruction rate. So you can see how labor markets are kind of these effects on labor markets because of slow adjustment of capital, as well as negative agglomeration effects, are actually negatively adjusting over time. The interesting thing here, and I'm going to conclude with this point, is that the informal sector, like it was in Vietnam, is also actually really important in adjustment to this import competition in Brazil. So what Dix Carneiro and Kovac do is they actually, using census data, they can check, like, well, what's happening to the employment and earnings in the informal sector, because the previous pictures that I showed you were just focused on the formal sector. And what happens is that over the 10 to 20 year period, expansion of the informal employment in this area is actually an important margin through which workers adjust. So initially, displaced workers become unemployed or out of the labor force. Okay, but over time, some of these people find jobs in the informal sector and kind of re-enter the labor force that way. That's like one thing that's actually very different between adjustment in the United States and Brazil. What Autodorn and Hansen have found for the United States is that when people become unemployed as a result of increased Chinese import competition, they are more likely to actually exit the labor force and start receiving Social Security disability insurance, and then never enter labor force again. In India, it's actually in Brazil, it's actually a little bit different. People seem to be using the informal sector as a buffer. Okay, so that was the fourth point. So let me conclude. So what are the takeaways? So what I want to emphasize is that both economists and public at large believes that trade generates a lot of aggregate benefits for the economy as a whole. Okay, but what we have learned is that it also has a pretty concentrated potentially negative consequences for inequality. And oftentimes when we talk about kind of the negative consequences of trade, we actually focus a lot on employment losses in import competing sectors. And those losses are very much something that we should be concerned about. But and those losses happen both in developed countries and in developing countries. It is not actually true that everybody in developing countries is benefiting as a result of international trade. People in developing countries in areas that are subject to more import competition are also experiencing hardship relative to other regions. However, what I actually find potentially even more striking about all the evidence from the recent literature from US and developing countries is how concentrated the losses are and how persistent they are over time. And the fact that even after 10 or 20 years, workers are actually not adjusting to trade policy change. In the developing countries, like informal sector plays an important role in these adjustments. And then the final thing that I want to emphasize here is that these labor market consequences of import competition also can spill over to other community outcomes, including kind of the education of next generation. That's something that we should be very concerned about when we think about how societies should be reacting to increased globalization. So, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this fascinating lecture. So now I'll open the floor for questions, comments from the audience. Right.
I have a question. First of all, a very nice presentation. Thank you. pursue policies that stimulate trade if on the one hand you have aggregate gains for the economy, but on the other hand you have major losses? And then in this lecture I also hear about losses being geographically concentrated and persistent. So my question is, could you say that it could be sensible to just pass up these opportunities where you could have more growth, but because of this growth being very unequal, that you'd rather say, okay, I should not pursue such policies?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I don't think we have like a good answer to it, but let me say how I think about it. So in particular, most of you have probably taken an international trade course, but even if you haven't, what we tell them, what we tell students there is, well, they're going to be winners and losers, but the governments can use the gains from trade to compensate those who are hurt by international trade. In reality, and especially in a country like the United States or less developed economies where government budgets are just not particularly large, compensating those who are hurt by international trade just doesn't happen. The good news is that I think like in European countries, because you have like a better developed social safety net, I think those who are hurt, be it by technology or international trade, actually can handle those losses, a little bit better than an individual in India or individual in the United States who loses a job. I think and I think in part of the reason why, for example, like in the United States, the response actually has been to import competition is that it's so concentrated and people are actually moving out of the workforce is exactly because of the type of welfare programs that the United States has. Because the welfare state in the United States has continued to be smaller and smaller, one of the few ways through which individuals can actually deal with negative labor market shocks, such as unemployment, is that they basically exit, they apply for Social Security disability insurance because there are no other ways. But we know that like when we try to like help unemployed people, the policies we should be making are the policies that don't discourage work. It should be policies that help you improve the match over time as opposed to something that discourages jobs. What the US has is exactly the policy that discourages jobs. So and the other thing, so that's one thing. The other thing that was really difficult in the United States is that the way its public funding is worked, because it's basically that schooling, policing, a lot of kind of provision of local public goods is all done by local property taxes. And just local taxes as opposed to taxes that are transferred from the federal government or the state government into the local communities. So that also can explain why we have this like very concentrated geographic losses, because when when workers are hit, they're going to be paying less local state taxes or income taxes. Their housing value is also going to go down. That's going to lower the tax base, and business tax base is going to decrease. And at the same time, what studies have shown is that like the inflows from the state and federal government is like way too small to kind of compensate that. So local provision of public goods, including education, diminishes. So I don't have like a good answer what to do, but it seems like by looking at how your public funding sector is designed and focusing on policies that help unemployed not by discouraging work, but helping them transition to another job, I think is a way to go. And like for once, I think regardless of what your political ideology is in terms of kind of the size of the welfare state, I think even the United States, the most libertarian people would probably believe into like equal opportunities for children. So figuring out how we can isolate how we can make sure that kind of these negative employment shocks don't affect the education of the next generation. It should be like really, really high priority, if not the main one, the first one. Thanks. Yeah.
Yeah, well, thank you for this fascinating talk. My question is about, so you mentioned the trade actually pulls people from agriculture into manufacturing and from self-employment or informal sector into the formal sector. And then what we know is that people get higher earnings and they work longer hours and earn more and don't hold on to jobs. But my question is, do we know anything about the actual health outcomes or job satisfaction outcomes of these workers in the new jobs?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's again like a very good question. And I think, so what I would say it's, the first progress that has been made is that, some of the studies that look at both like formal and informal sector have had actually kind of representative surveys that cover like the entire labor force. The disadvantage of those surveys is that, things that you observe in them, it's usually like wages, employment opportunity, and, in some of them, actually, kind of hours work and maybe like access to a few benefits. However, you don't get like super detailed questions about work satisfaction and so on. I think what's always, so there's one study that I'm familiar with that has like a great research design. This is a study by Chris Batlin and I think Steve Drecken from Ethiopia, where they gave people, it was a randomized control trial where they gave people either access, like either just some cash, they could do with that whatever they wanted to, or they gave them a way to like match them with an employer in the formal sector. And what they find is that like people that are, so basically to like a formal wage jobs, and what they actually, and then some people were not, some other people were in the control group. And what they actually find is that health outcomes and the work satisfaction was actually lower for people who obtained access to the wage job relative to the workers who just got like the cash voucher and could start a business or the control group. So that could potentially indicate that some of these jobs actually don't offer, if we look at the health outcomes or work satisfaction, maybe these jobs are, might provide higher wages, but, might be worse off on other outcomes. One concern I do have about that study is that only 3 employers agreed to be in this randomized control trial. So one thing that I would like to know is like, how do those employers compare relative to a general population? Because the advantage of the studies that I've discussed about, they are nationally representative. So that's one study. The other thing that I should remember, there's a great study by Matilde Bombardini and Lee on China that actually shows that this expansion of export opportunities in China actually led to increased mortality due to higher pollution and worse health outcomes. So again, that's like a potential negative consequence even of these expanding export opportunities. The nice thing about that study is it is nationally representative. So I think what we need to do going forward is, to try to figure out how can we get do more studies that are more nationally representative that actually look at like outcomes such as health, such as worker satisfaction, to better understand like what comes with a formal job. What I think it's like harder to do is like studies that just that just survey workers who are in companies because that are formal, who are, for example, saying they work long hours and so on, because we don't know what the counterfactual is relative to what these workers would be doing absent those jobs. Thank you.
Yeah, I was going to ask, much of what you talked about today and the kind of examples you gave is very much in the language of economic agents making their own free decisions, people deciding whether to switch from formal to informal sector or to migrate to prosperous regions or such like. But I think many developing countries have much more managed economies, certainly the China example, and I think, though I might be wrong, that's kind of more the case in Vietnam as well, that the government follows a slightly more Chinese model compared to, say, for example, India, where they can almost put people into different sectors or move people, and if not literally, then at least with strong incentives. And I was wondering, therefore, if you thought such central economies or such managed economies actually maybe have the potential to fare better in terms of rebuffing the negative impact of import competition and some of these other, or in general, if there's a differential exposure to these kind of negative aspects of trade?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question, and a question that continues to be very wildly and heatedly debated within economics. So, for example, you have Danny Roderick, who believes, you have most of the profession probably, who believes that, basically kind of pro-market reforms and free trade lifted a lot of people out of poverty, and absolutely that contributed to the rise to decline of poverty in countries like China, perhaps Vietnam. But at the same time, this was very state-managed transition toward like more pro-market markets. And Danny Roderick oftentimes points out that perhaps the fact that China did not let state-owned enterprises die very quickly and was very heavily involved, that helped ease the transition in a country like China, perhaps even in Vietnam, vis-a-vis some countries in Latin America where governments were more, did not lead to these interferences. I think it's a good question for sure. Like, if you have, there's actually a recent paper by a graduate student from Yale that actually shows how China is using state-owned enterprise employment to lower the dissatisfaction and unrest, especially among prime males. So that's one study that I've actually seen that kind of tries to get at this question. Like, can you use state-owned employment almost like as a insurance, and to control kind of satisfaction, or like make sure or diminish kind of potential unemployment, kind of negative unemployment consequences. But I haven't seen much else. Most of this debate actually has been more, without the evidence. One interesting thing about India is that India has implemented kind of national works programs and things like that, and they are which could be viewed as like an active labor market policy that might help people match with employers. And we actually, and there are quite a few studies that focus on kind of the benefits and costs of that. But yeah, I think it's a good question, and I think it requires more research to gain more evidence. Yeah.
Thank you very much for this brilliant lecture. I was thinking about, you had a nice story about tariffs and formalization. So where tariffs are lower, the formalization are high in industries. That's the kind of story. So I have been thinking that this India stands out to be defying that logic quite a bit, because since 2000, tariffs have been falling substantially across the board in all the industries in India. But if you look at what is happening in terms of formalization, there is no improvement in formalization. If any, actually, informality has been increasing in many sectors in India. So how do you, what would be the insights? So do you have any insights on that? I mean, apart from perhaps the labor market rigidities, which you talk about, and the regional disparities, perhaps?
Yeah, that's an excellent point, and I think it's like a point that suggests that, and you already kind of started hinting at that, is that, trade policy is like one aspect through which countries can, that's going to be influencing informality, but there are many other factors. There might be domestic distortions that might be influencing informality as well. And vis-a-vis India, there's, some people have suggested that perhaps the informality continues to be large because exactly from what you said, like this labor market rigidities, because it's very hard for businesses to expand. The other thing that some people have suggested, this is work by Ann Harrison and her co-authors, is that India until recently had a lot of policies that basically gave preferences for kind of small-scale manufacturing. And what they show in a paper from, I think it came out like a couple years ago in American Economic Review, is in sector, like once some of these preferences for small-scale manufacturing were abolished, these industries were able to expand. However, there are probably like many other factors there as well. I think both of these kind of touch that, provide some explanation for why informal sector remains low, but not full explanation. Yeah.
Yeah. So if you talk to people at Untitled, for example, they often indicate that the full fruits of trade liberalization can only be reaped if this type of policy is complemented by more liberal investment policies, promoting FDI and things like that. And do you have any opinions on whether investment policies can be designed in such a way that some of the negative implications of increased trade can be mitigated to some extent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, again, this is not an area that I'm too familiar with in detail, but in principle, one could do something like that. What concerns me with investment policy is that oftentimes basically what oftentimes governments do is they give, especially in developing countries, foreign firms kind of tax breaks to enter their country. And especially when government revenues are very small, like one question that I always have with that is would these companies be doing this in the absence of tax breaks anyway, and perhaps they're receiving these breaks just because they have more bargaining power. Just, to give you an example of Vietnam, Vietnam has had a huge inflow of foreign direct investment during the time period, from 99 to 2009. For example, in 99, 5% of manufacturing employment was in multinationals. By 2009, it's like a quarter. Probably, even without tax incentives, a lot of these companies would find it profitable to set export platforms in a country like Vietnam. So that would be kind of like a wasted resource in that regard. So that's one thing that I would be concerned about regarding that. But to the extent that if there are domestic market failures, so you don't have access to capital, perhaps having investment policies to relieve some of these investment constraints by bringing in foreign capital could be warranted. But I think you always have to keep in mind is is it in governments, is it optimal to offer subsidies, and B, in which cases offering the subsidies would be helpful.
It's more of a general question, but since trade generates aggregate gains, but overall in both developed and developing countries, it's unequally distributed. So the big question is why usually we learn that you always have winners and losers, but winners seems to be those that already have been winners and are winners. So why aren't there actually enough incentives to change this trend of inequality that is happening?
Yeah, so I would say, again, very, very good question. What I would actually say that even, for example, if you take actually China and Vietnam, a lot of people that benefited from expansion of international trade were people who were living in poverty prior to integration of these countries into the global economy. So I think, trade has definitely, lifted some of these people out of poverty, and these were not necessarily people who were expected to benefit. That said, it is true that kind of people, the more educated individuals, perhaps people with better political connections, just connection in general, those tend to benefit even more. How do you change that? I think that's a big question that we have to have as a society in terms of what sort of tax system we want to have, what sort of welfare state we want to have, what sort of education system we want to have, and I think that's oftentimes very country specific. It's a very good question. I think kind of beliefs and the ideology about this. It's hard to change. Yeah.
So, thank you for your lecture. When you study trade and inequality, did you also look at inequality in terms of increased profits and reduced wages? You only talk about wages and earnings, and I'm asking this because if wages go down, as you showed for Brazil, but profits go up, that's a reorientation of the country's revenues. Which might increase inequality, but it would be outside of the scope of your study if you only look at wages and earnings. And that would be relevant to compensations because profit usually has a lower tax and it's easier to move out. So that could erode the opportunities for governments to actually compensate. So the idea that first you have the decision to have trade and then you have a decision to compensate the losers, they are not separate decisions because trade provides opportunities to compensate the losers. Did you look at profit?
Yeah, so the studies that I focused on today just focused on labor income, as I mentioned, because most of them kind of rely on household surveys and population census data. There's some of the studies that I mentioned, like how workers are affected, do actually look at companies' performance, but profits are actually kind of notoriously difficult to measure, so they haven't actually looked at that explicitly. But more to the point, I think what's actually really relevant for your question is how are those profits taxed, and how do firms react in terms of their location decisions? Where do they produce, or where do they even show where the profits are? The only study that I'm aware of this actually has now data, because it comes from income tax data that could actually handle both capital gains, profits, and income, is actually Nina Pavcnik and a few co-authors are using data from Ecuador's tax authority to look at some of these issues. And probably there's some of the work that people in public economics have been doing on taxing of multinationals and companies could contribute to that. But that's actually, I think this intersection of public economics and trade is very much an area that deserves a lot more work going forward. Because I agree with you. How we can tax labor versus capital, and the fact that capital might be much more mobile internationally has huge consequences for kind of the size of the government revenue and taxation.
Final question.
Okay, thank you for your presentation. It was amazing, but that's talked about in the lecture as well, because this kind of international trade reduces inequality between countries in general, but also I think this kind of international trade increases the inequality within the country. For example, in bigger countries like China and India, for example, if we take a look at China, most cities or provinces that are benefited from the international trade are the cities in the south or in the east, and they have the GDP per capita that's similar to some of the most developed countries in the world, while you have the west part of China that is still out of that are just out of poverty. So do you think the ongoing international trade will actually worsen this kind of inequality within the country? And also, will this kind of situation motivates these countries turning to kind of protectionism instead of being more open to international trade?
Yeah, so to the first question, I think these sort of regional differences are very, an inequality across different regions is actually very important, because, and this is why I think it's important to emphasize that they're going to be winners and losers even within countries like China, who at this point almost everybody views as a poster child for successful globalization. And exactly what you said is the coastal provincial areas benefited substantially more than kind of the more rural regions that were left behind. And some of the issues are going to get even worse, as the population ages, and a lot of kind of elderly are left, were left in the rural areas. Even in China, most people relied on their family to kind of take care of them in terms of retirement. China does not have a well-designed social security system to deal with that. Benefits that rural areas receive are much smaller, and now most of the children are actually in the provincial areas. So I think these are kind of big issues that governments, through tax and social policies, could potentially address. So that should be pretty high. That should be a pretty high agenda. And your second question was. Protectionism, yeah. So I think there, we already, as I showed earlier on, at this point, the demands for protectionism in most lower kind of countries that started off as low-income countries, such as China and Vietnam, are actually, at least in population at large, not there yet, because these people, on average, citizens in those countries benefited. But I imagine that. But I think that's actually a little bit. worrisome, because like part of the reason why these countries, why maybe the dissatisfaction with trade was not that large, is also because these countries had like really large growth rates in the past 10 years, like, a country like China or Vietnam, or to the extent India. However, once the growth, you can only grow so long until the diminishing returns set in. Once and basically plus, like, the global markets are going to be influencing that. Like, once the growth slows down, I think some of these similar inequalities that are becoming very obvious in a country like the United States, they are also lurking. They are also lurking behind in developing countries. As I mentioned, for example, aggregate poverty in Vietnam or China or India has been declining because of economic growth. So oftentimes when we observe this like negative consequences of trade, they were visible just as like smaller reduction in poverty as opposed to actual increase in poverty. But once growth slows down, they will become more visible. So, you could see that perhaps some of these countries will also start calling for protection if kind of economic growth slows down more broadly. That's definitely the case in in experiences of Latin American countries that have been going kind of back and forth between opening of markets and closing them down over the past 20 to 30 years. Just, take the case of Argentina, for example.
Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
We brought you a few gifts. Now, this is very well known to everybody in the audience, perhaps not to you. Unfortunately, it's raining today.
Okay.
If you catch a regular flu, then then this is the Dutch medicine for that.
Good to know.
And we brought some other gifts for you. One is a picture book of the city of Groningen. Thank you so much for this lecture. It was wonderful.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for having me here. Yeah.
Thank you, and thank you all in the audience for the discussion. As said ahead of time, please join us for drinks in the plaza. And, thank you.
I don't know how to turn this on. Oh. Thank you.
You're welcome.